She asked for a second snack, and the pilot decided to publicly shame her, not because of what she said, but because she was a little black girl who dared to sit in first class. He didn't whisper. He took the intercom, turned the entire cabin into a stage, and humiliated her in front of strangers like she was some kind of threat to luxury. "This isn't a charity flight," he said, his voice soaked in arrogance. His words aimed to remind her exactly where he thought she belonged. And when her father stood up, not yelling, not even angry, just calm and proud, they were both escorted off the plane like criminals. No reason, no apology, just silence. The kind of silence that protects people like him and erases people like her. But what that pilot didn't know, what no one on that flight could have imagined, was who that little girl really was, and who her family really was. And when the truth hit, it hit harder than any turbulence he'd ever faced at 35,000 feet. This isn't a story about snacks. This is a story about humiliation, power, race, and what happens when you try to put someone in their place, only to find out they built the room you're standing in. Before we get into it, drop your location in the comments. Where are you watching from? And if you believe some people are long overdue for a reality check, hit like, subscribe, and stay until the end. What you're about to see, the real turbulence, is just beginning. The cabin of Flight 1627 was bathed in the soft gold of morning light, flickering through oval windows and catching the edges of polished tray tables and the leather trim of first-class seats. Passengers settled in with the quiet efficiency of seasoned travelers, checking messages, adjusting seatbacks, flipping through glossy magazines. In Seat 2A sat Serena Moore, a 10-year-old girl with honey brown skin, tight braids pulled back into a neat ponytail, and a soft pink hoodie that matched the sparkly unicorn charm on her backpack. She was quiet but curious, her small fingers tracing the seam of the snack bag she'd just finished. Next to her, her father Elijah sat calmly in a charcoal blazer, scanning the morning's headlines on his tablet, glancing occasionally at his daughter with the half-smile of a man used to both travel and the quiet companionship of a bright child. The plane hadn't taken off yet, but the service had already begun. A tray of drinks passed by, and Amara hesitated only briefly before pressing the small silver call button on her armrest. A soft chime sounded overhead, and moments later, a flight attendant appeared, an older man with a tight expression and stiff shoulders. His name tag read Kurt. "Yes," he asked, tone clipped. Amara smiled with a child's natural sweetness. "May I have another snack, please?" she asked. Her voice was light, polite, barely audible over the hum of the engine. Kurt stared at her for a long second. "You already had one," he said. Amara blinked. "I'm still hungry." He gave her a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "First class doesn't mean bottomless snacks, sweetheart." Then he walked off, his polished shoes snapping against the floor. Elijah looked up, brow furrowed. "Was that necessary?" he murmured. But before he could do more than shift in his seat, a sudden static crackled over the cabin speakers, and the voice of the pilot filled the space, calm, calculated, but unmistakably condescending. "Ladies and gentlemen," said Captain Brent Holloway, "just a reminder that this is a premium service. First-class amenities are limited and not open to negotiation. This isn't a charity flight." The air went still. Passengers paused mid-sip. A man 2 rows up turned his head. A woman with a designer handbag gave a small, surprised laugh. Amara's hands froze around the empty snack wrapper. Her wide eyes filled slowly with confusion, then with something heavier. Elijah's jaw flexed. He looked at his daughter, then toward the closed cockpit door, then toward Kurt, who passed again, without looking at them. Somewhere near the galley, a young flight attendant stood frozen, hand clutching a paper cup of coffee. Her name was Lacey, barely 2 months on the job, her uniform still crisp, her nerves still raw from training modules on diversity etiquette and brand tone. She had seen everything. She had heard everything. And now she was watching the rest of the cabin pretend they hadn't. She glanced down at her phone. Then, hands shaking slightly, she tilted the device up and tapped the record button. She didn't know what she would do with it. She only knew what she'd seen was wrong. But recording wasn't safe. It could cost her the job she had fought so hard for. Still, she kept filming, the lens barely peeking from under the sleeve of her uniform, capturing the sight of a little girl too young to understand how deeply she'd just been insulted, and a father quietly seething beneath a mask of calm. A whisper passed down the aisle. "Did you hear that? Was he talking about that kid?" The tension was brittle, electric. Elijah didn't speak. He reached into his carry-on, pulled out a hardback novel, and placed it on the tray table. Amara leaned her head against his arm. "Was that about me?" she asked in a whisper. "Don't worry about it, baby," he said, but his voice was tighter than before. In the cockpit, Brent Holloway adjusted the trim of his headset and smirked. He knew what was coming. The same performance dressed in a new uniform. Just as he handed over their boarding passes again to the returning flight attendant, Kurt, back with reinforcements, another voice emerged behind them, colder, less practiced in fake courtesy. "Sir," the woman said, stepping forward in a blazer that bore the airline's corporate crest. Her name tag read Dana. "We've received a report of a potential discrepancy in ticketing for seats 2A and 2B. Elijah tilted his head, his tone composed but cutting. "A discrepancy? The tickets were issued under my name and my daughter's. Paid for, confirmed. What's the discrepancy?" Dana didn't meet his eyes. She looked down at the iPad in her hands, pretending to verify details that had already been verified multiple times. "We're going to need to revalidate your form of identification," she said, as if they were checking a teenager sneaking into an 18-plus movie. Elijah reached into his inner pocket and slowly handed over both their passports. He said nothing, because the wrong words now, any tone above calm, would be used to justify what they'd already decided. "You don't belong here." Dana took the documents and scanned them into her device, her eyes narrowing, not because something was wrong, but because she was trying to find something wrong. When nothing popped up, she turned to Kurt with a look that said, "We'll talk later." And with no apology, no acknowledgement, no admission, she simply handed them back and walked away. Across the aisle, in seat 2D, a man in his late 40s shifted in his seat. He had seen it all, the snack, the intercom announcement, the tension, and now the ID check. He wore a muted gray sports coat, gold wedding ring, and the discomfort of someone debating if this was worth the confrontation. His name was Paul Bennett. He leaned slightly forward and said, not loud but clear, "That didn't seem necessary." Kurt turned, eyebrows lifting just enough to register the comment. "Excuse me." "The way you're treating them," Paul said, nodding toward Elijah and Amara. "It's not sitting right with me." Kurt's mouth tightened. Dana, not far away, snapped her head toward Paul, her voice low and deliberate. "Sir, we appreciate your concern, but it's best if you remain uninvolved. These matters can escalate quickly." Paul's eyes narrowed. "I'm not trying to escalate anything. I'm saying this feels wrong." Dana stepped closer, her voice dipping further. "With respect, sir, I suggest you don't involve yourself in issues that don't concern you." Her smile was weaponized, tight and lethal. "We wouldn't want you to get flagged too, would we?" Paul fell silent. Not because he agreed, but because in that moment he understood. This wasn't an isolated misunderstanding. This was a machine, one he'd just heard grind its gears to life. He looked toward Amara, who stared at her hands now, pretending not to listen. Elijah sat taller, but his eyes held a quiet fury. He'd seen this mechanism before in boardrooms where contracts were reconsidered the moment he walked in hotels where front desks lost his reservation, in country clubs where he'd been mistaken for the driver. The airline was just another gate, and this cabin another form of velvet-roped exclusion. Kurt returned moments later with 2 additional attendants, all tight smiles and customer service masks. "We'll be conducting a quick security verification," one of them said, a line so vague it could mean anything or nothing. Elijah leaned forward just enough to speak, not to fight. "Are you scanning every passenger in first class for ticket fraud, or just the ones with brown skin?" The attendant blinked but said nothing. A few rows ahead, a young woman with earbuds out finally turned to watch. Others had already begun filming with phones tilted subtly against headrests and tray tables. Dana noticed and hissed a quiet command to Kurt, who stepped back slightly, nodding toward the cockpit. Within seconds, Captain Holloway's voice returned over the speakers. "We'll be experiencing a brief delay while we finalize manifest checks. Thank you for your patience." Paul looked at Elijah and gave a small, apologetic shrug. "They won't let us help, will they?" Elijah smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "They don't need help," he said. "They need exposure." In the back of the cabin, Lacey, the young flight attendant, watched the scene unfold from the beverage station. The air had become oppressive, not from altitude or pressure, but from the silence of passengers too afraid to speak and crew too trained to suppress truth. Lacey stood frozen in the back galley, her phone dimming in her hand, a silent witness to everything unraveling in real time. Then, without fanfare, two uniformed men stepped into the cabin, their dark blue security jackets bearing the airline crest. They walked with practiced precision, their eyes focused, unreadable. One leaned down to Kurt, who nodded once and gestured discreetly toward seats 2A and 2B. Dana reappeared, her face unreadable, her voice wrapped in corporate neutrality. "Mr. Moore, Miss Moore," she said, "we need to ask you to deplane. The captain has requested your removal for the comfort and safety of the cabin." Elijah blinked once, slow and deliberate. "The comfort of who exactly?" he asked. Dana's smile didn't waver, but her eyes flinched. "Please collect your belongings, sir." "On what grounds?" Elijah asked, his voice calm, precise. "There has been no disturbance. I've followed every directive. My daughter has done nothing wrong." One of the security men stepped closer, shifting his stance. "Sir, this doesn't need to be difficult," he said. The subtext was clear. The threat wasn't loud, but it was real. Elijah stood without further protest. His movements were measured, purposeful. The way a man moves when he knows all eyes are watching, and history has seen this play out before. He helped Amara from her seat. She looked confused, blinking back tears, clutching her unicorn backpack against her chest. "Did we do something wrong, Daddy?" she whispered. "No," he replied softly. "We did everything right." As they moved down the aisle, heads turned but mouths stayed shut. Paul Bennett averted his eyes, shame burning on his skin. The woman in 2F looked away entirely. Even Lacey couldn't move, her breath caught in her throat, her body screaming to intervene, but her job, and everything she'd worked for, tightening around her like a seatbelt locked mid-crash. No one said a word, not even thank you. The terminal was colder than Elijah remembered. Amara sat silently in a plastic chair near gate 34, her knees drawn up, her arms wrapped around them. She didn't cry at first. She just stared through the window, watching the plane taxi away, lifting into the sky as the last sunlight dipped behind the horizon. Then it hit her. A single sob swallowed back. Then another. Elijah knelt beside her, resting a hand on her back, feeling the helplessness that only a father could know. A fury without a target, a rage wrapped in restraint. Meanwhile, high above them, Flight 1627 soared toward its destination. The mood in first class quieter now. Dana walked back toward the galley, her heels echoing along the floor, her mouth twitching into a small smirk. Inside the crew's private chat, a flurry of messages pinged one after another, confined to the flight crew's internal tablet system, meant for logistics, but often misused. One read, "Snack scammer cleared. Cabin peaceful again." Another, "Guess she thought first class came with a buffet." A third, 10 years old and already playing the race card. Future lawyer in the making. Lacey saw it. Every message. Each one a slap sharper than the last. She gripped the edge of the galley counter, her fingers widening. For a moment, she hovered over the screen, uncertain. Then she tapped screenshot, once, twice, again, backing up the messages to her personal cloud under a hidden folder she'd named Justice. Outside, in the cold terminal, Amara wiped her nose on her sleeve, her eyes glassy. "I just wanted another snack," she said, almost inaudibly. Elijah closed his eyes for a beat longer than a blink, then looked at her. "It was never about the snack," he said. "It was about who they think deserves more." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He didn't call legal. He didn't call the press. Not yet. He called someone else. Someone whose number lived in a protected contact list titled, Negotiation Tier 1 emergency only. "It's Elijah," he said. "We have a problem. And it's going to get very public." Back on the plane, Lacey sat down in the staff seat near the emergency door, locking herself in with her thoughts. She had been silent too long. She had seen too much. And now she had proof that the airline hadn't just tolerated the injustice. It had normalized it, laughed about it, circulated it like gossip. While Amara lay curled under the covers in silence, eyes red from hours of trying not to cry, Elijah sat at the edge of the bed, phone in hand, staring at a breaking headline flashing across the screen of a popular travel blog. "Passenger ejected from first class after disrupting crew. Flight delayed." The subheader added fuel. Witnesses say man became agitated over seating arrangements, refused to cooperate with airline staff. Elijah's jaw tightened. The video attached to the article showed shaky footage from a passenger's phone, only it began after the intercom announcement, after Amara had already been humiliated, after Elijah had already stood up. It showed him standing calmly, but framed to look imposing, his stature and voice emphasized while the crew appeared flustered and composed. The crucial context, the request for a second snack, the condescending broadcast, the racial implications, had been sliced out completely. The airline's official statement was even worse. Released on their corporate social media page, it read, "On today's Flight 1627, we regret that a passenger refused to comply with crew instructions after a routine seating reassignment. Our staff followed standard de-escalation protocol. The safety and comfort of all passengers is our top priority." Elijah read it twice. Then again. He didn't scream. He didn't slam his phone. He simply stood, walked to the desk in the corner of the room, opened his laptop, and began typing. Meanwhile, somewhere far above the spin zone of airline PR, Lacey stared at the same article on her phone inside her tiny crew apartment, hands shaking. The words felt like acid on her skin. Routine seating reassignment. She had been there. She had filmed it. And she knew damn well there was nothing routine about it. She scrolled through the comment section of the airline's post and watched with growing horror as people echoed the headline's narrative. Should have just followed the rules. Tired of people playing the victim card. Why are these types always causing drama? Every sentence twisted the truth deeper into the public consciousness. Lacey's heart raced. She had the full video. The entire incident from the moment Amara asked for the snack to the second they were escorted out. No edits. No manipulations. Just raw, painful reality. Her thumb hovered over the upload button on her personal profile, but something stopped her. Going public under her own name would be career suicide. The airline would bury her, blacklist her, possibly sue. But she couldn't stay silent either. Not after what they did to that little girl. She opened a private browser tab and navigated to the encrypted tip line of an independent news outlet, Voxscope Investigative. It was small, underfunded, and fiercely unafraid. The kind of place that still chased the truth instead of clicks. She uploaded the video along with a short message. "I am a current crew member. This is unedited footage from Flight 1627. Passenger was calm. Child was respectful. They were removed for asking for a snack. This was not about security. This was about race." Then she hit send. And she waited. The next morning, the story had already started shifting. The unedited clip was posted to the front page of Voxscope's website under the headline, "Exclusive, raw video contradicts airline statement on Flight 1627 incident. Did racial bias play a role?" The footage was damning. Amara's small voice requesting a snack. Kurt's dismissive tone. Holloway's voice blaring over the intercom with a barely disguised sneer. The security team arriving, not in response to any threat, but to enforce humiliation. And Elijah, calm, composed, never raising his voice, never causing a scene, merely asking for fairness. Within hours, the story exploded on social media. Hashtags like #SnackShame and #FlyingWhileBlack trended nationwide. Public figures began weighing in. Activists reposted the clip with messages like, "This is why we don't stay quiet." Even celebrities shared the video, demanding accountability. The airline's PR team scrambled. Their official posts were now flooded with thousands of angry comments, customers threatening boycotts, others requesting refunds. They quietly disabled replies, then removed the original press release entirely. But the internet never forgets. Elijah, watching all of it unfold from his hotel room, didn't smile. He didn't feel vindicated. He just felt tired. He glanced at Amara, who was now watching cartoons with the volume turned low, the bags under her eyes darker than they should be for a child her age. He returned to his laptop and began writing again, this time not a letter to the airline, but a formal statement to his legal team. The viral storm was still raging online, but he knew something deeper needed to surface, proof, not just outrage. Then the email came in. It was short, unsigned, but precise. I worked at Meridian Airlines. I know who Captain Brent Holloway really is. Call me. Below, it was a burner number. Elijah hesitated only a moment before stepping outside into the brisk air and dialing. The voice on the other end was cautious, low, but steady, a woman, early 40s maybe, who identified herself only as Mel. She'd worked for the airline for 7 years, 4 of them as a lead flight attendant under Holloway's command. He's done this before, she said, more times than I can count. But HR always protected him. Elijah listened without interrupting. Mel continued, naming at least 3 incidents over the last 6 years where passengers of color had been removed from flights captained by Holloway, cases filed as non-compliance or security precaution, all swept under vague procedural language. We were told to follow orders, Mel added, and to document things in a way that wouldn't reflect poorly on the airline. They made it sound normal, but it wasn't. It was targeted. Elijah thanked her. Then he asked if she would go on record. She hesitated. I'm willing to provide testimony, if this goes legal, but I can't be public. Not yet. Elijah understood. She wasn't hiding, she was surviving. The next morning, he forwarded the call transcript to his legal team, along with a growing list of names that had emerged online, people commenting under the viral video who claimed they'd also experienced discrimination while flying Meridian. One user, at Jamal Knows Wings, wrote, "Same pilot kicked my mom off her flight in 22. Claimed she refused to follow safety rules after she asked for help storing her cane." Another woman posted a screenshot of an old boarding document and said Holloway had once had her downgraded because she looked lost in first class. The comments piled up, thread after thread of quiet injustice, finally finding daylight. Elijah's attorneys began sorting through them, cross-referencing names, flight numbers, timestamps, building what they called a behavioral pattern matrix. 2 days later, a law firm in Atlanta filed a preliminary motion for class action against Meridian Airlines, citing systemic bias and repeated discriminatory practices involving Captain Brent Holloway and specific members of his crew. The filing included a list of 13 individuals across 6 states, each with eerily similar stories: denied service, downgraded seats, fabricated behavioral complaints, and above all, silence imposed through fear and buried beneath NDAs. National news caught wind. Meridian faces class action lawsuit over racial discrimination allegations, the headline read. More importantly, a well-respected anchor on morning television brought up a damning internal detail: a leaked HR document showing that Holloway had been internally flagged 3 times for complaints involving inappropriate tone and selective passenger removals. No corrective action had followed. Instead, he'd been promoted twice. Public pressure hit hard. Meridian stock dipped 7% within 48 hours. Investors began asking questions. The board of directors called an emergency session, but it was too late to contain the fallout. Online petitions demanding Holloway's termination and a public apology from the airline surged past 500,000 signatures. Activist groups started planning protests at major airports. Meanwhile, Elijah remained composed, working behind the scenes with his lawyers, consolidating witness statements and verifying flight logs. He wasn't out for revenge. He was building a case that would make sure this never happened to another child again. One evening, a producer from a major news outlet called him directly. "We want to give you airtime. Let you speak your truth." Elijah agreed, But only if the segment included footage of Amara, uncut and unedited, showing exactly how calm, how innocent, how unfairly targeted she was. The network aired it during primetime. In the clip, Amara looked up at the flight attendant with wide, patient eyes and asked, "Can I please have another snack?" That single sentence echoed across the country. The public no longer saw a man accused of disruption. They saw a father shielding his daughter from quiet cruelty masked as protocol. Lacey, watching from her apartment, felt a tear slide down her cheek. Her decision had meant something. Mel, too, saw the segment and reached back out, this time with a signed affidavit and permission to testify. By the end of the week, the hashtag #SnackShame had amassed over 30 million impressions. TikTokers reenacted Amara's soft-spoken snack request in side-by-side duets with corporate apologies. Twitter threads dissected Holloway's past flight records like open case files. Even late-night hosts made monologues out of the absurdity. A man with 4 stripes on his sleeves felt threatened by a 10-year-old girl asking for pretzels? Really, public sentiment was no longer aflame. It was wildfire. Activists held sit-ins at Meridian terminals from JFK to LAX. Passengers wore shirts that read "Amara asked nicely" in bold block font, and celebrities began to weigh in. Academy Award winner Talia Green tweeted, "They didn't just eject a child, they erased her voice." Not anymore. #Justice for Amara. Athletes posted videos saying they'd never fly Meridian again. Influencers documented their attempts to refund unused flights, tagging the airline with every post. Elijah watched it all unfold with a calm that belied the storm around him. He knew trends burned hot and died fast, but this one was different because it wasn't built on sensation, it was built on substance. Amara, still shy around the cameras, agreed to speak in a short video recorded by Elijah and released through his legal team. In it, she looked directly into the lens and said, "I didn't want to cause trouble. I just wanted a snack. I didn't know asking could make people so angry." Her voice cracked on the last word. The clip went viral within hours. The country heard a child's innocence and couldn't unhear it. But not everyone welcomed the storm. Meridian's top brass panicked behind closed doors. The PR director tried to reclaim the narrative by pushing a pre-recorded segment through their preferred media affiliate, a sit-down interview with Captain Holloway himself. It was intended to be damage control. Instead, it was gasoline. In the interview, Brent Holloway wore his full uniform, the gold trim on his epaulets polished to gleaming perfection. He looked straight into the camera and delivered what he must have thought was an articulate defense. "We live in a world," he said, "where asking for an extra snack becomes a political statement. People now want power, leverage, attention, over something as small as a bag of chips. I've flown through hurricanes. I've landed jets in war zones. But nothing prepares you for entitled passengers trying to turn a snack into a civil rights issue." For 2 seconds, the studio was silent. Then, the internet exploded. The quote hit the front page of every platform within minutes. Headlines shouted, "Holloway compares civil rights to chips," "Captain misses the point by 30,000 feet," and "Snackgate pilot calls victim entitled." Public responds swiftly. Comments ranged from disbelief to fury. Some dissected his language. Others created memes. One viral video looped Holloway's quote with footage of Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat, ending with a caption, "At least she didn't ask for pretzels." Within 12 hours, the airline's board issued a vague statement that Captain Holloway's personal views do not reflect the values of Meridian. But the damage was done. A petition for his termination hit 1 million signatures. Former employees began coming forward not just with stories of discrimination, but of Holloway's arrogance, his unchecked authority, his pattern of condescension toward crew and passengers alike. Pilots from other airlines posted anonymous testimonials on Reddit, the kind of captain who memorized procedures but ignored people. Textbook skill, zero empathy. Amid the chaos, Lacey finally received word from the legal counsel she'd quietly retained. Her anonymity would hold, and she would be protected under federal whistleblower laws. That same day, she found a note slipped under her door from another flight attendant she didn't know. "Thank you for what you did. You're not the only one who's had enough. Meanwhile, Elijah declined every mainstream interview. He didn't need more airtime. He needed more truth. He focused on building the legal scaffolding behind the social noise. He contacted Mel again, helped her safely document her testimony. He supported others joining the class action suit. But most importantly, he shielded Amara. She returned to school the following week, and while her classmates greeted her like a celebrity, she simply smiled and said, "I just want to be normal again." But normal had changed, because somewhere in the noise, a shift had happened. Not just online, but in people, in how they looked at injustice, in how they recognized silence as complicity. The room was calm, quiet, exactly how Elijah liked it. On the wall behind him hung an abstract painting titled Leverage, a quiet reminder that true power often moved without sound. Until now, Elijah Moore had remained intentionally silent about his identity in relation to Meridian Airlines, not out of fear, but strategy. For the last 9 months, he had been in confidential acquisition talks with the airline's board, negotiating a private equity deal to secure a controlling stake in Meridian's international fleet division. The deal, valued at over $800 million, had progressed smoothly, kept entirely out of public view. Elijah had sat across from the same executives, now scrambling to extinguish the fire that consumed their brand. He had shaken hands with their CEO, toasted with their CFO, walked their boardroom floors with a quiet authority that made people lean in, not because he demanded it, but because he commanded it. And they never knew that the man whose daughter had just been humiliated on their flagship route was the same man weeks away from owning 31% of their global holdings. But now things had changed. Elijah leaned forward, placed both hands on the oak table, and looked each of his advisors in the eye. "We withdraw," he said flatly, effective immediately. His lead attorney, Paul Denton, didn't blink. "Understood. You want me to cite public ethics or strategic misalignment?" Elijah looked toward the window, toward the skyline burning gold. "Both," he said. "And make sure the wording reminds them they lost this, not me." Within the hour, his team submitted the formal withdrawal documents to the SEC and Meridian's Acquisition Council. The ripple effect was immediate. By noon, financial news outlets picked up the story. Major investment firm abruptly exits Meridian acquisition following discrimination scandal. Headlines blared with terms like collapse imminent, unrecoverable brand damage, and Elijah Moore pulls out board stunned. The market response was brutal. Meridian stock, already bleeding from consumer backlash, dropped 11% in a single afternoon. Institutional investors began selling in waves. Mutual funds flagged Meridian as high risk. By evening, a CNBC anchor referred to it as a controlled demolition triggered by arrogance. Meanwhile, inside Meridian's headquarters, chaos reigned. The board scrambled to issue a public statement to reassure stakeholders, but their words felt hollow against the financial body blow of losing the single largest private investor they'd courted in years. Analysts speculated that without the Moore acquisition, Meridian's expansion plans in Europe would dissolve, crippling their ability to compete against newer global airlines. For Elijah, the revenge wasn't in the press or the numbers. It was in the silence. The silence that now consumed the very people who had once sat across from him with smiles too wide, words too rehearsed, and assumptions too narrow. They had judged Amara by her age, her skin, her seat. They had judged Elijah by his restraint. And now they were learning what that restraint had cost them. The morning after the withdrawal, Elijah received a call from one of Meridian's board members, Robert Chase, a man who had once praised Elijah's visionary leadership, while privately questioning whether he could steer a legacy brand. Robert's voice was different now. "Elijah, we were blindsided," he said. "This whole situation, it's a tragedy really. We didn't know." Elijah didn't let him finish. "You didn't want to know," he said. "You had every opportunity to ask. You had every signal to reflect. But you chose silence. And now, you'll live with the consequences of it." Then, he ended the call. In the days that followed, op-eds poured in from respected economists and business leaders, dissecting Meridian's collapse not as a fluke, but as a lesson. Asterisk, when companies prioritize control over accountability, one article read, they lose both. Meanwhile, Elijah didn't bask in headlines. He focused on Amara. They took a break from the city, flying privately to a quiet beach town where Elijah once vacationed as a boy. Her name was Serena Moore, a figure known in quiet business circles as one of the most strategic financial minds in North America, a woman who rarely appeared in press, but whose signature had reshaped multiple industries from energy to aerospace. What few knew, until now, was that Serena was not just Elijah's wife and Amara's mother. She was a majority shareholder of Orion Global Holdings, the parent company behind Meridian Airlines. Her shares weren't tied to public boards or vanity titles. They were embedded in Class A preferred stock, buried beneath shell entities and offshore trusts, accumulated over a decade of patient acquisition. While the world had fixated on Elijah's public exit, Serena had watched everything unfold from her high-rise office overlooking Manhattan, with a precision honed over years of quiet warfare in the upper echelons of global finance. She had seen the video. She had watched her daughter be humiliated, her husband be defamed, her family's dignity sold for press damage control, and she had waited. Now, the time for silence was over. On a gray Monday morning, Serena Moore entered the boardroom of Orion's corporate headquarters wearing a tailored navy suit and no jewelry except for a platinum watch engraved with the word resolve. Around the long table sat 13 directors, some who had only met her once, others who had spoken to her through intermediaries, never quite realizing how much power she truly held. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "This emergency meeting," she began, "is convened under the authority of Class A controlling interests to evaluate executive misconduct and enforce immediate structural changes within Meridian Airlines." There was no preamble, no debate. She laid out the violations: PR negligence, systemic discrimination, breach of fiduciary duty in response to investor fallout, and most critically, cultural and reputational sabotage that directly impacted Orion's global brand. She cited the shareholder damage, the market backlash, the flight manifest discrepancies that had now come under FAA scrutiny. The room shifted from smug to silent. When someone attempted to question her, an older director with too much confidence and too little foresight, she turned toward him and said, "If I wanted your opinion, I would have diluted your voting power 6 quarters ago. Shall I?" He sat back down. Within 40 minutes, Serena presented her proposal: immediate termination of Captain Brent Holloway, Chief PR Officer Caroline Drexler, and 3 senior vice presidents responsible for oversight, internal compliance, and customer experience. Each name came with supporting documents, internal emails, leaked Slack transcripts, and legal memos showing prior incidents that had been covered or ignored. No one argued. The vote was unanimous. Serena signed the dismissal orders herself, placing her initials beneath each executive's fate with steady, deliberate strokes. By noon, a press release from Orion Global shook the business world. Orion enforces leadership restructure at Meridian Airlines. Cultural accountability and justice are not negotiable. The release didn't hide behind vague platitudes. It named the firings. It acknowledged the scandal. It condemned bias. And it did something no one expected. It publicly apologized to Amara Moore by name. "Our company failed her, and that failure ends now." News anchors broke the story live, stunned not just by the corporate cleanup, but by the revelation that Serena Moore had always been in the room, quietly watching, quietly holding the power they thought Elijah had walked away from. But the truth was Elijah hadn't withdrawn out of surrender. He had withdrawn to make space. Space for Serena to act without constraint, without negotiation, without the burden of press optics or investor appeasement. It had been coordinated, calculated, absolute. Serena did not speak to the media. She did not tweet or post statements. She let her actions ripple outward. Inside Meridian, panic set in. Department heads received new directives. Training programs were suspended. A full audit of employee behavior was launched. And for the first time in the airline's history, they hired an external civil rights counsel to restructure hiring and service policies from the ground up. Elijah and Serena met that night in a private lounge on the top floor of the Orion building. It started with a single email sent to an anonymous tip line created by Orion's External Civil Rights Task Force. The message was short, raw, and unsigned. "I worked under Holloway in 2018. I filed a complaint. HR buried it. I still have the emails." Within 48 hours, that single voice became hundreds. Former flight attendants, junior captains, ground crew, and even regional managers stepped forward, sharing records, emails, text chains, and recorded calls, each one telling the same story. Discrimination cloaked in procedure, retaliation disguised as policy, and a culture built not on service, but silence. The breadth of the revelations triggered immediate attention from the Department of Transportation's Office of Civil Rights, who joined forces with the EEOC and FAA to launch a formal federal investigation. Within days, federal agents arrived at Meridian headquarters with sealed warrants, backed by subpoena orders for all internal communication logs dating back 10 years. Panic swept through the remaining leadership like a storm surge. Executives scrambled to lawyer up. One resigned before the subpoenas were even served. But it was too late. The evidence was overwhelming. Digital forensics teams uncovered internal Slack messages where HR reps mocked complainants, audio files of Holloway belittling a Nigerian passenger over an accent, and archived reports with racial slurs redacted by hand, never formally processed. Even more damning, they discovered an internal program known only by code, Tier Visual, which flagged passengers for extra scrutiny based on visual mismatch with seating class profile, a euphemism that, when decoded, directly correlated with race. The media dubbed it the Manifest Scandal. Senate hearings were called. Airline CEOs from other major companies were summoned to testify on anti-discrimination compliance. And amid it all, Brent Holloway, once the proud captain of Meridian's elite transatlantic fleet, received a letter from the FAA revoking his commercial pilot license effective immediately, citing repeated violations of federal ethics and discrimination statutes under Title VI. The decision was public. The language was brutal. Captain Brent Holloway demonstrated a sustained pattern of discriminatory behavior incompatible with federal service and public trust. His pension was frozen. His career was over. In a desperate move, Holloway appeared on a fringe podcast, claiming he was being scapegoated, that woke culture had destroyed decades of aviation expertise. The backlash was immediate. Sponsors dropped the podcast. The episode was flagged for misinformation. His reputation, once adorned in medals and wings, now existed only as cautionary tale. But the fallout didn't stop with Holloway. Meridian Airlines was fined a historic $320 million by federal regulators for civil rights violations, systemic retaliation, and obstruction of reporting procedures. In addition, over $150 million in private settlements were awarded to victims of a Tier Visual profiling program. Partners began to walk away. 3 global travel conglomerates suspended all contract negotiations. A major international carrier terminated a code share agreement, citing irreparable ethical misalignment. Travel booking platforms began placing warning labels on Meridian flights, and by the end of the quarter, domestic bookings had fallen by nearly 42%. Shareholders revolted. A special vote of confidence was called to restructure Meridian's entire board. By the time the dust settled, only 2 original members remained, both of whom had publicly supported Serena Moore's reforms. And even as justice roared through legal channels and financial metrics, it resonated deepest in the people. Lacey, the young flight attendant who had recorded Amara's first interaction with the crew, was formally recognized in the final federal report as the initial whistleblower. She was awarded a protected status under the Whistleblower Protection Enhancement Act and offered a senior training position under Orion's newly formed Equity in Aviation division. She accepted not because of the title, but because she could now help reshape the very system that once terrified her into silence. In schools, Amara's story became a discussion point in classrooms, ethics case studies and law lectures, and spoken word poems at open mic nights. Parents, educators, and travelers alike began to see what had once gone unnoticed: how small moments of disrespect, when left unchecked, could reveal institutional rot. Brent Holloway stood at the edge of a small tarmac in rural South Carolina, wind rippling through his faded flight jacket as a group of eager kids, most of them black or brown, all of them wide-eyed, gathered around a single-prop Cessna 152. He wasn't in uniform anymore. He hadn't worn a captain's bars in nearly a year. The name Holloway no longer opened doors in aviation circles or earned nods from air traffic control. It earned only silence now, or sideways glances. But he didn't blame them. He had earned every ounce of that silence. After the FAA revoked his license, after Meridian Airlines publicly severed ties, after his name was stripped from leadership roles and burned across headlines, Brent had disappeared from the industry he once thought he ruled. He sold his downtown condo, withdrew from his private pilot associations, and moved into a quiet rental near the same crop-dusted airfield where he'd learned to fly 35 years earlier. He didn't return to reclaim anything. He returned to listen. He spent months avoiding press, ignoring messages from old colleagues, and staring at a folded-up copy of the FAA's final report that he still hadn't thrown away. But then something changed. He received a letter, not from a lawyer, not from a regulator, but from a 10-year-old girl in Georgia named Kira, who wrote, "My mom says you weren't nice to Amara, but she also says people can learn if they try. I want to fly someday. Will you teach me?" That letter sat on his desk for weeks before he replied. When he finally did, he said yes. And then, quietly, without cameras or reporters or redemption arcs, he began teaching again. He didn't charge. He didn't advertise. He just showed up every Saturday at the airfield and waited to see if anyone else would come. By the end of the first month, 6 kids were showing up regularly. By the third month, there were 20. Some came from underfunded public schools. Some had never been inside a cockpit before. But all of them wanted to fly, and all of them watched him with the kind of curiosity that demanded humility. Brent didn't hide who he was. He told them everything. The video, the mistakes, the way he'd once seen the world through a filter of rank and race and reputation. He didn't sugarcoat it. And maybe that's why they kept coming back. 1 year after the incident, a local news station picked up the story. They sent a young reporter named Deja to the airfield with a camera crew. She expected to interview an embattled ex-pilot looking to save face. What she found was different. She saw kids gripping yokes, their eyes full of wonder. She saw Brent in the background, wiping oil from his hands, his shoulders slightly hunched, not from age, but from weight. In the interview, Deja asked him directly, "Why now? Why this?" Brent looked away for a moment before answering. "Because flying's about more than just taking off," he said. "It's about who you take with you. And I spent too many years thinking this sky belonged to people like me." He paused, swallowed. "But that little girl, Amara, she reminded me that the sky's big enough for all of us. I just wasn't big enough to see it." His voice cracked slightly. "She taught me more about honor in one flight than I learned in 30 years. The clip aired online and reached over 3 million views in a week. But Brent didn't go viral. He didn't trend. And that was fine. This wasn't about redemption through popularity. This was about presence, being where he needed to be, for the people he had once overlooked. Meanwhile, in New York, Serena and Elijah sat together on a panel at Columbia University, discussing ethical leadership. They didn't mention Brent by name. They didn't need to. They spoke about systems, about quiet harm, about the responsibility of power. And Amara? She started her own nonprofit, Wings for Her, a youth aviation foundation that offered scholarships, mentorship, and STEM training for girls of color across the country. She never mentioned pretzels in her speeches. But everyone knew why the movement began. A year after the scandal, Meridian Airlines, now under new leadership, new training systems, and external oversight, launched a new slogan: "Everyone deserves to fly." It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. In a private hangar on the coast, Amara visited Brent once. No cameras, no microphones, just her parents, and a quiet handshake between a former captain and the girl who had grounded him in truth. They didn't talk long. She only said, "You're trying. That's enough for me." And in that moment, the story closed. Not with applause, not with triumph, but with understanding. That justice is not just consequence, but change. The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss what comes next. We're just getting started. What did you think about Brent's final transformation? Do you believe people like him can truly change? And where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments. We'd love to hear from you.